What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a lore primer for Avowed ahead of its release, mostly in response to a whole bunch of questions I've been seeing popping up about the world the game is set in, known as Eora. Avowed is putting you in the role of an imperial envoy of the Aedyran Empire to the living lands, so you can investigate a plague known as the Dream Scourge. But obviously, just in saying that, I've mentioned a whole bunch of things that you may not understand the meaning of, and thus, that's what this video is for. But do keep in mind, this absolutely should be a game you should be able to jump into and play and learn these things as you go. There's a glossary of terms in the game itself, which I know firsthand from a preview from back in November, and interviews, etc. But obviously, there's a whole world's worth of lore here to explore, mainly via the previous two games in this setting known as Pillars of Eternity. But worth a mention right away that Avowed here is meant to be a sort of side story, so it's not going to necessarily advance any of the events that happened in those previous games, but will of course add context to a different part of the world, because the Living Lands had never been shown previously, only talked about. So needless to say, there's a lot to go over here, but as it just so happens, a couple years ago, in fact, I made a whole lore series about this particular setting. I'm going to link that playlist down below, so if you want an expanded look at any given topic, you may well just find it there. But what this video is going to do is cover the most pressing stuff for this game, Avowed. Meaning that basically this is the primary stuff you want to know going into it, and it may well point you in the right direction for topics you want to learn more about, but it is by no means everything. That all said, let's finally jump into this fully, starting with the world itself. So one of the most important things to know about this world is the wheel. The wheel in this particular universe is the cycle of life and death. Basically, every living thing, when it dies, its soul gets funneled to Aedyran pillars. This is a sort of green luminous stone that is dotted throughout the entire world and are often referred to as the Pillars of Eternity. People's souls enter these Aedyran pillars and then travel to a place called the Beyond, where they wait their next turn in the wheel, which is where they are reincarnated into some other life form. And simply put, round and round it goes. But a few important things to note about this right away. The wheel itself is a natural process, but it has some unnatural elements that we'll get into momentarily. But basically, the wheel has always existed, this is just what it does. However, as you might expect with anything like that, sometimes things don't work out particularly well. Things can go wrong in this process. This leads to things called soul maladies, problems with a soul or just oddities that might occur, which aren't necessarily big problems, such as soul twins, which is when like two people each get half a soul. Or, as was a big part of the first game, somebody could be hollow-born, or basically they don't get a soul, which can lead to all sorts of problems, which is one of the things that brings us to the Engwithans. Now, several thousand years before the events of the first couple of games, and thus Avowed as well, as Avowed takes place shortly after, just a couple years from the second game, Pillars of Eternity 2. But thousands of years before that, the Engwithans society existed. Engwithans were big practitioners of a science known as Animancy. Animancy, simply put, is the study of souls. They can use this study to work all sorts of incredible machinery that can do all sorts of crazy stuff. The Engwithans, over periods of centuries, mastered this technology, and used it, of course, to study the world around them. Namely, what happens after life and death, is there anything out there? And the answer that the Engwithans found was a disturbing one. Basically, they found that there were no gods or anything of that nature beyond the scope of what was known in the universe. And if there ever were any gods, they're certainly not there now, was basically the gist of it. But that's when the Engwithans, alongside the Huana of Ukaizo, banded together to undertake an experiment of sorts. You see, at this time, there were thousands of little deities and things being worshipped to by any given tribe or civilization around the globe at that time. But the thing is, as we just pointed out, none of them were real. They weren't things that existed. And so the Engwithans and the Huana came up with a plan to make them real, or specifically 11 of them real. And using their great mastery of animancy, the Engwithans ultimately sacrificed untold numbers of their own society in order to use their souls via animancy to craft sort of artificial gods. This forms the Engwithan pantheon. There are ultimately 11 of these gods, but for the sake of this video, we're really only going to focus on one of them, Woedica. If you want to learn more about the others, part of that lore series I mentioned. But we are focused on Woedica for two reasons. One, the presence of the Steel Garrote, which is her paladin order in the Living Lands, but also the fact that we are an Aedyran envoy. The Aedyran Empire warships Woedica specifically, so naturally she's pretty important. But before we start discussing Woedica, something to know is that part of the way in which the Engwithans tamed the wheel in order to make all of this happen was that they created a bunch of machinery at the city of Ukaizo. This basically destroyed the city and much of the Huana civilization at the time, and while also ascending these Engwithans to godhood via their collective souls, it also did something else, which was it shackled the wheel, so to speak. As I mentioned, the wheel was always a natural thing that happened, but it was prone to problems. As part of this process, and this machinery they put in place to ascend to their godhood, what they actually wound up doing was sort of giving the wheel structure and purpose, because the gods feed off the soul energy created by the wheel in order to sustain themselves. This made the entire process mostly more efficient, resulting in less of these soul-related problems. It didn't completely get rid of them, mind you, but it certainly lessened them. And we'll double back to that in a moment when we start talking about the plot of the first two games. From there, though, let's talk a little bit about Woedica. So, when the initial plans were drawn up to create these 11 gods, Woedica was intended to be the head of them, the strongest one, the ruler. And that is exactly what happened. Woedica, at the height of her power, could basically do anything she wanted. This didn't sit well with the other 10 gods, and they ultimately overthrew her. This is why Woedica now is often referred to as the queen that was, the exiled queen, or the burned queen, because she was quite literally burned by another god, Magrin. But in any event, Woedica, as the ruler of that initial pantheon, covers the domains of things like law and justice and rightful rule. The catch of that is, though, Woedica is a rules for thee but not for me kind of person. Woedica believes that a rightful ruler has the ability to impose rules and laws, and as such they are above them, meaning that she's very much a lawful evil type of person. Now, Woedica's been involved in all sorts of stuff, but the two things I want to drive home here are that she is the patron god of the Aedyran Empire. In fact, the hereditary monarchy that rules that empire does so by the divine right of Woedica, which also means that her paladin order, the Steel Garrote, are very, very popular there. Much of what the Steel Garrote does is tracks down oathbreakers or anyone that, broke a contract, disobeyed the law, things like that. The Steel Garrote, much like Woedica herself, are anything but friendly, very much so, again, the lawful evil type. Because much like their own goddess and ruler, they believe that as paladins of Woedica, they can basically do whatever they want, as long as it's within the letter of the law. Except they also get to make those laws and bend and break them as they please, provided they have the force to back it up. Now, before we start diving into slightly more specific topics, I first want to take a few moments to talk about the plot of the video games that came previous to Avowed, Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, as they drop some pretty big reveals. For starters, we learn about the recent troubles of the Aedyran Empire and how they have lost colonies. Pillars of Eternity 1, for instance, takes place in an area called the Deerwood, which used to be a former colony of the Aedyran Empire. Another big part of Pillars 1 is the study of animancy, as you might guess, because the world and civilization is starting to relearn its secrets following the Engwithan pantheon largely erasing it from history, basically covering up the tracks of how they were made. This is why animancy is actually just straight up illegal in the Aedyran Empire, which worships Woedica. But in Pillars 1, we learn a few things. For starters, everything I just told you about the gods, basically, the fact that they were in fact crafted from Engwithans. But another big part of Pillars 1 is actually a plot by Woedica using her chosen servant, Theos Ix Arcanon. Woedica, using her godlike power, basically saved Theos from his turns through the wheel. Every life he lived, she would reawaken who he was, so he remembered everything, basically. So he could continue his work for Woedica as her chosen servant, willing to do whatever it is he pleased, which is namely covering up the existence of the Engwithans and how they ascended to godhood. But also in Pillars 1, we find out that Theos, using old Engwithan technology, is intentionally funneling souls towards a certain point in an attempt to empower Woedica, so she could retake her place as the full-on ruler of the current pantheon. And that's one of the potential outcomes of that game. But the main theme there is just Woedica being desperate for power. and also everything I mentioned about the Aedyran Empire, which brings us to Pillars of Eternity 2. So that game starts out by a giant statue that is set in your stronghold, Cadnua, from the first game, suddenly coming to life and killing you, actually, and marching off towards the Deadfire Archipelago. This statue turns out to actually be housing another god, Eothas, the god of light, redemption, dawn, etc. You see, Eothas had done something similar previously when he chose an avatar of a normal man known as Weidwin, or Saint Weidwin as he's known now, who was himself ultimately killed via the god bomb, but Eothas returned via this statue to carry out his mission again. You see, Eothas took a great amount of umbrage with what the gods did, that is to say, hiding their presence from the Kith, which are the civilized races, and he set out to rectify this by going to the Deadfire Archipelago and smashing the machinery at Ukaizo, which is set there. Ukaizo, if you'll remember, was the ancestral city of the Hawana people, an old empire that was around at the same time the Engwithans were. Remnants of the Hawana are still around, but obviously not at the same level of strength. Now, throughout that game, you'll be chasing the statue across the archipelago, but it is ultimately successful. In every single ending, Eothas destroys the machinery at Ukaizo, which was powering the wheel. This effectively means, because of how long it was doing so, that the wheel is broken. It no longer will function as it was supposed to naturally. Meaning that at the end of Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire, the world is in an extremely difficult place because while the wheel will continue to finish its current cycle, basically, which is another couple of generations, eventually it's going to stop turning, which will mean that the process of reincarnation will stop, meaning that people will start being born without souls, ultimately potentially leading to the just complete wiping out of civilization. And because nothing is turning through the wheel, which is where the gods get their sustenance from, they would eventually die out as well. And Eothas did this as a means of forcing these two peoples to work together, the gods and the current civilized races. So it's very much so a learn to work together or everyone's dead kind of thing. Now, at the time Avowed starts, that is not widely known information. Avowed only takes place a couple of years after this, and Pillars of Eternity is a world largely stuck in feudalism. Information doesn't travel insanely fast here. So people are basically just starting to learn about what happened there, and even then the full extent isn't known. Now, as I mentioned though, Avowed is a side story, so expecting it to tackle that is extremely unlikely. But obviously, it'll probably be referenced. Now, what will play a more direct role, however, is the information we learn about godlikes in Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire. You see, no matter what kind of character you make in Avowed, you will be a godlike of an unknown god. And we'll touch more specifically on what a godlike is here momentarily. The most important thing we learn in Deadfire about them is that godlikes are effectively batteries for the gods who made them. And at any time, the gods who made them can recall that power, thus killing that person, and reclaiming that energy for that god, effectively like a failsafe to gather power when needed. And because of the events at the end of Deadfire, it's safe to say that that moment in time has come, which is why, in the preview that I played in November, where it referenced that most godlikes have gone missing, the obvious gist of that is that following the events of Deadfire, most gods just recalled all of their godlike in order to reabsorb their power, thus resulting in all those godlikes being missing or just straight up dead, which makes your status as a godlike of an unknown god extremely interesting because no one knows what deity you belong to, but also the fact that most godlike are gone, so what are you doing here? Now, I will talk more about the godlike here in a bit, but to be clear, and the biggest thing to take away, being a godlike is not necessarily a good thing. That's the key piece of information to hold on to. From there, though, let's talk about the Aedyran Empire and the Living Lands before moving on to some other stuff. Starting with the Aedyran Empire. This empire is currently the largest one, though thanks to its recent setbacks via the loss of some of its colonies, its power is being tested lately. It is, nonetheless, an empire that is a merging of an elven and a human empire or kingdom, thus resulting in the Aedyran Empire. Quite some time ago, a bunch of human tribes on the central continent of Aedyr formed together to make a proper kingdom, which was very much so rooted in feudalism, and after several wars and things with the neighboring Kulikan, I think it is, civilization of elves, they eventually decided to just join together and become one giant empire, the Aedyran Empire. This is ruled by a joint hereditary monarchy, which is primarily ruled by the human side of it, but whoever the human human ruler is takes on an elven consort, which serves as the other half. Now, as an empire, again, they mostly practice feudalism, with everything coming down to the rule of law, as judged by Woedica herself, as they are big fans of her. And as such, they are not big fans of animancy. In fact, animancy is just straight up illegal in the Aedyran Empire. So whereas it has been studied and seen huge breakthroughs in areas like the Deerwood of Pillars 1 or even the Archipelago of 2, none of that is happening in Aedyr because it is illegal there. Now, for simple reasons, that is because it is dangerous and will result in potential catastrophes related to the soul, but also because Woedica doesn't want people finding out more and more about what it is the Engwithans did to become gods, because she will suffer no rival. But a few other things of note: while the Aedyran Empire is primarily humans and elves, you can still occasionally find members of other races there, though in much, much smaller numbers, such as dwarves, Amawa, or Orlans. But first, now let's talk about the Living Lands. So the Living Lands, the area of the world the game takes place in, is really interesting because prior to this, it was not a place you ever went to. It was only ever described as a place sort of overgrown and overflowing with life that people mostly went to avoid everyone else, to get away from the rest of the world. But as we saw in that recent preview, that's starting to change, with members of the Aedyran Empire going there to clearly try and set up another colony, which is at odds with local populations who have mostly been doing their own thing undisturbed up to this point, against the backdrop of a wild, untamed wilderness that is dramatic in its landscapes and biomes. And that was before, of course, the Dream Scourge came and started causing problems with people going functionally insane with all these fungal growths everywhere. But then let's talk about those other races. Now, I won't bother explaining humans and elves. They are exactly what they are everywhere else, which is also true for the dwarves. So what I would like to do instead is focus on the more interesting ones, Orlan and Amawa, before we start talking about the godlikes. So Orlans are the small in stature, covered in fur with large ear types. They tend to be naturally very smart, and their mental acuity saw them pioneering things like ciphers in the area of Air Glanfath. But basically, you'll see these small furry guys every once in a while. But then we have the Amawa. They are the most physically imposing of all the Kith races, or the civilized races, standing a good head and shoulders taller than everybody else, but also completely covered in scales. They don't have skin so much as they do small scales everywhere. What's more, they also have shark teeth instead of normal teeth, and if you couldn't tell by all of that, they tend to prefer the coast and water. You can find them elsewhere, mind you, but that's just sort of their natural affinity. Coincidentally, a sort of rival power for the Aedyran Empire, the Rawatayan Navy, has a lot of Amawa as well. Thanks to their stature, they are very strong, and thanks to their teeth, generally pretty intimidating. Now, every single race I just mentioned, humans, elves, dwarves, Orlans, Amawa, can all be host to what are called godlike. Godlikes are, simply put, an individual of any race who was blessed, let's say, by a god in the womb. Thus, they came out with physical manifestations of whatever is associated with that god. As I've already mentioned, this isn't necessarily a good thing. In some cases, it's definitely more of a curse. But that's also not a universal thing either. For instance, we see all sorts of cases throughout the games where some of them are actually pretty well loved by their gods that made them, whereas others are indifferent at best, and some are even borderline hostile to each other. Thanks to their appearance and all the different cultures of the world, how godlikes are viewed varies wildly from the type of godlike it is to the place that they are born. So as an example of this, we see Tekehu in Deadfire, a water godlike of the goddess Andra, the goddess of the sea. But the thing is, while Andra loves Tekehu, and she made him very specifically, she also has a bunch of other godlike known as moon godlike that honestly don't seem to mean much at all to her. But Tekehu, thanks to his nature with the sea goddess and the fact that he was born to the Hawana tribe, which worships water and lives on the ocean, saw a very privileged upbringing where he was largely seen as a good omen, whereas godlikes of, say, Skane, who is a deformed-looking god of violent rebellion, basically never make it past birth. It's rare that they aren't killed almost immediately, assuming they survived to begin with thanks to the deformities. But in almost every instance, the god that is associated with a certain godlike is almost always immediately identifiable, which brings us to us, basically. In Avowed, we play as an imperial envoy of the Aedyran Empire who is a godlike of an unknown god. Now that's interesting because the fact that everyone looks at you and has no idea what kind of godlike you happen to be or what god you're associated with is naturally a mystery. Though we are an imperial envoy for an empire that is very much so dedicated to the goddess Woedica. And last but not least, we are there to investigate the Dream Scourge, a strange malady of the soul resulting in crazed, often violent fungal manifestations on people, which leads them to lose all sense of themselves. And that is basically everything I think you should know going into Avowed. Everything besides that is, certainly extra and will help you fill out the blanks or little gaps, but I would say everything I've gone over in this video is the most pressing stuff to know ahead of playing Avowed specifically. But if you have any other questions, by all means ask them in the comment section below, or simply check out my previous lore videos. You might find some stuff in there that answers some questions of yours. But I do think this video should serve as a pretty great way to catch up before jumping into Avowed specifically. So hopefully you wind up agreeing, but I think obviously we'll see here in a couple weeks when the game is out. But for right now, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.